So the other part of our security controller that we need to also bring in or import in is that Authenticator class that we've just discussed within the login action. So I'm just going to bring that in. Use MagmaCore that's located within the auth directory, and we want the Authenticator class. Now this class contains a lot of static methods, and just like how we've defined these properties and the class, we're going to be doing the same thing for our authenticator. So we're going to say authenticator, and we're going to point it to that particular class, class, because remember, our login action is looking for this property in order to get access to that, in order to get access to those methods within that authenticator class, right? So we must declare it as a dependency, just like this. Now, obviously, when we come to our security controller, it's going to be referencing users from our user model, but obviously we haven't got a user model right now. But what I want to do, actually, I want to go on the front end and click on submit and just kind of see what it's doing, right? Let's see if it, well, we know it's going to throw up errors because we haven't got a database set up, we haven't got any of that set up, so we know we're going to be getting some kind of error. I just want to see what error now we're going to be getting. So I'm simply going to reload, that's fine, click on login, and nothing actually happens. It doesn't actually do anything. So let's look at the actual action and see where this form is pointing to. Look at the source. Let's just reload this again. Or better still, let's type in login, hit that login route, view page source, and look at the action. So that action is pointing back onto that same method within that controller. So it's pointing back to the index method, which is going to post on itself through that execute method from our login action, right? And you can see all the attributes that we've set within the form class. We got the class that we've set, and we've also got, what else have we set? We set the action, which was done dynamically for us. But you can see other default attributes that got passed to the form is the method post, the ENC type, and we also post the target, which is going to post back on itself, right? And you can also see that we also, all the CSRF tokens that is automatically injected into any forms that we're using. So that's the HTML that's been generated from that file, that login form that we've created. So let's close that. Let's switch our screen again, and let's see what we need in order to get our login form to start actually log us in. So at this point, we're going to actually take the time to create a new directory within our app directory called model. We're going to create our first model. I'm going to just sort of walk you through the steps of creating a model, because again, like our controller classes, once we do one, then it's pretty much the same for all our models. So let's minimize that. Let's create a new directory. I'm going to call up model, and our first model that we're going to be creating is our user model. New PHP file, user model, just like so, right? So we're going to do all the same declaration that we've been doing. So we're going to be declaring strict type. I'm going to say namespace, say app, and now we're in our model directory, right? And say class, and just call this user model, right? Now there's a couple of stuff that we must extend. and that's going to be the abstract user model. So I'm going to say extends abstract abstract user model, if that's what is abstract base model, I should say, not user model, abstract base model, which is down here, just like so. You can see it imports the actual class for us from our core directory, just like so. So with each model, we're also governed by an interface which is defined within that abstract base model class, and that interface sets out a couple of stuff that we must adhere to. So the first one, or the first couple that we must do in any model, we have to define the name of our table and optionally define the primary key string, right? So how we do that is we're going to be declaring some protected constant. So I'm going to say protected const, and we're going to say table schema, and that's going to equal to users. Now table schema is the constant name that we must use. We cannot deviate from that particular name, right? Table schema name is the name, is a constant name that the abstract class or the abstract base model is looking for, and other parts of the framework as well. But what we can define is the name of our table, and that could be whatever name that we've given or user table. But in our case, it's going to be users plural, right? And we're going to also define the table schema ID, which reference the primary key for a table, and that's going to be ID, because that's mostly what we call our tables in our database, which is an auto incremented field, a unique identifier, primary key. We're going to be calling it ID. I mean, you can call it whatever you want, so long as it matches the column in your database table, right? Now, we also must declare a public constructor. Just like our controller class, we must also declare our public constructor. So public function construct, and you can see that it auto completes for us as well. And you can see it requires a couple of, three arguments. And the first is going to be the table schema ID, and the entity which is linked to this particular model, which is going to be the user entity, right? So for example, if this was a permission model, you would also have a permission entity which we must pass in into the parent constructor. And all we do that is going to get rid of these, and we're also going to get rid of these because we don't actually need these. We only need them to be defined in the parent constructor. And how we define these constant is we use a self : or the self keyword, self : table schema. So we'll say self : table schema ID, and the third argument, which is going to be the entity, which we have not yet created as well. So I'm going to pause this right here. I'm going to go ahead and create that entity because it's also pretty simple what we're doing. So I'm going to create another directory within this app directory called entity. So I'm going to say entity, and within that I'm going to create a new file called user entity, right? So what I'm going to do with the entity is I'm going to declare the actual constructor and declare the class, and extend the base entity object that we need for each of our entity. So again, pretty standard declaration. We've got a namespace, the app, and now we're within our entity directory. And to say class user entity, we're going to extend that base entity, just like so. And believe it or not, that is all we need to do. Once upon a time, we add methods within this entity, but I realized that the methods that we've got is like a duplicate in each entity. So what I've done is I've created a base entity, I've defined those methods in, and in order to get access to those methods from each entity, we're simply going to extend that base entity, right? And we're going to pass this class to our model. Now you might be asking, why is it empty? It's empty for a couple of reasons. Well, it doesn't have to be. If you've got something specific, you could pass those in. But the reason why we've got different entity for each model is because other parts of the framework is also looking for that, because that's how we can uniquely segregate certain things, certain components that we're going to be using. And as we get deeper in, I will show you what exactly I'm talking about. So for now, they're all empty by default, but if there's something specific that you want to pass in for a particular entity or create for a particular entity, you can do it within this, and then you can call that using even methods that I have defined in the base model, which calls a particular entity, right? So let's close that for now, and we're simply going to call it in, import it to say app entity this user entity. We're simply going to pass it in like this. So user entity : class, right? That is the 3 arguments that the parent constructor requires. These are absolutely must, right? Now the next thing that we want to do is we also need to declare a abstract method that is defined within the abstract base model, which you can, well, you can't see this pop-up that I'm getting, but there's a method called guarded ID that we also must pass to each model. So I'm going to declare that method, and it's a public method, and it's called guarded ID, just like so. And we're simply going to return an empty array for now. So the idea behind this method when I created it is so we can pass in an array of IDs that we want to bypass. For example, if you got a user account, or for example, if you are a super admin, we can pass the super admin ID in, and if you try to like do certain actions on that particular ID, it will kick you out. It will just say you're not allowed to carry that action out on these IDs. So these are guarded stuff that we can't make changes on, or some changes on, or we can't delete. Right? It's mostly to do with deleting, because you don't want to be deleting yourself, right? So what this guarded ID does is protect yourself from doing stuff like that, or doing stuff like that. Again, it's not something that you're going to need to return in every method, but it's a method that has to be implemented in every model, right? And what else do we need from these model? I guess at this point, this is the basic structure of all our models. The most important part of these models is the table schema is a tool constant, and the fact that we're returning the parent construct with the relevant parameters. That is a basic model. That is all you need to actually get access to data from the database, right? Because once we create this model, it opens up the gateway for us to access any data from our users table. And obviously we haven't got a database set up yet. Well, we've got one set up, but we've not yet linked it to this project, right? So any methods, any additional methods that is not part of the core framework that we want to implement, like something specific to this user model, like for example checking if email exists, or doing any other sort of like method that uses the model to get data from a database, or even just simple method that helps to do what you're doing within this particular model, we can declare it in here as well, and that will be specific per model, right? Because in here we've got access to the database through a method called getRepo. So if I say getRepo like so, that provides me with access into my repository, and it also provides me access to all my CRUD method. So if, for example, if I wanted to fetch all data from a database, I could do something like find all, like so, and I don't need to define anything else. That will fetch all the records from my database. But one thing we also must do is, if we want to access this model from a controller, we simply need to reference that model within our dependency. So let's bring in our user model. So I'm going to say app model user model, just like so. And we're going to bring it in, and we're going to give it a name of repository user model, just like so. And within our method, we simple can do something like this: repository getRepo find all, and that will simply get us all the data from our database. This is effectively what we've done just a minute ago, right in here, where we've got this getRepo and find all. But when we're in our models, we don't need to take that first step. We just jump straight to this getRepo method, find all. But in our controller, we have to define the class and assign it to our property and access it from that property, then getRepo find all, right? Now this is also important, especially when we come to writing our user controller. We must declare our user model using this repository key, right? We must do that because for some reason I started out using that as a key, and it's been so long now I've not changed it, and I've developed so much thing around this particular key, and it's all to do inside of the application, nothing outside in the core. But I'm going to leave it as it is, purely because it's fine. It's not a big deal, right? I mean, we could have said model, but I said we're going to leave it as it is, as repository. But I don't think we need this in this particular class, because as I'm saying, we've got the authenticator that does all the validation for us, and it's actually using the user model internally to do all of its bits. So once we got this class defined, our authenticator is going to see that and then does what it's doing internally. So now that we've got a user model, we've not yet got a database. So we need to like set up a database, and I'm going to actually use the one that I've already got running because it's already got all the tables and data in. At a later date, or as we get into the course, we're going to go through our data schema. We're going to be building these, or show you how to build these schemas so we can create migration files from it and migrate these to our database, right? Because we have now got the ability to do stuff like that. So what we need to do next within our user model, that's going to be it for now with this model. That's all we need to access the data within a database. So we're going to try and actually fetch our data by trying to connect our application to our database. And that's also going to be pretty simple. So we're going to find our env file, and we simply just need to connect it, which it already is, because this was like a copy from our folder that we did in our first couple of videos. So really we sort of like already got access, because all the information, the database name, the host, we're using a username which is root, and we've got no password set. All right, so effectively we should be able to pull some data from our database. So I'm going to test that out. I'm going to create a var dump. I'm going to see if I could dump out any data through this index action method within our security controller. So I'm going to say user equal var dump. I'm going to kill the script below, so we're not executing anything else. I'm going to say user. Right, now let's see what we're going to be getting back. If I go switch my screen, let's reload that. And we're getting an application error, and that's cool. And let's check what that error is. So it says call to our member function get repo on null. Right, get repo on null. And the reason why we're getting that error is because we did delete what we had declared within this definition. So let's put that back. Let's use app model user model, and let's define that repository again. Repository user model : class. Just like so. Let's try that again. Switch my screen. And there you go. It dumps out all the information that we've got in our users database table by a simple calling that find all method. And again, we've got a lot of method within our repository that we can call that's going to fetch information based on the conditions that we pass as arguments. Like for example, I can use, switch my screen again, I can use find object by method returns an object, and the first argument is the conditions that we want to find an item by. So we can find an item by, so for example, ID, and we're going to say we want the first user with the ID of 1, right? And if I switch my screen again, if I reload, you can see it returns one object right there with the user of the ID of 1, which is right there, right? We can even filter this out even more by declaring what we want to, by declaring all the columns that we want to return, because at the moment it's pretty much returning an object of all the column defined on that users table, but we can return only the ones that we want, and that's going to be in the second argument of this particular method, and that's going to be an array, and we can say give us the first name, give us the last name, and also give us the email and the ID. So we'll get the values of the 4 column that we've defined as a second argument on this find object by method. Switch my screen again. Let's reload. And you can see now we're only getting the first name, last name, email, and the ID. I mean, that's as simple as it is. I said we've got at least 15, 16 different methods within the repository that we can use to get various different types of results. And this is just one way of doing it. I should switch my screen actually. This is just one way of doing it. We're accessing the repository directly, but if we want to get the actual CRUD method that is providing the repository with these access to the database, we can actually get those directly as well. And we can do that, if I delete this, we can do that by repository, get repo. We're going to say get em, which stands for entity manager, and on that we're going to say get CRUD, right? Then we can call like the read method, and the first argument we're going to actually pass, let's remind myself what the argument list was, and I think the first argument would have been the conditions. Let's try that again. So we're going to say ID 1, and we're going to say we need the first name, last name, let's just get the ID, right? So let's switch our screen again, reload, and we get an empty array because I might have gotten the arguments mixed up. I said I've written these a while back now. Let's just swap these around and see if it requires the selectors first, then the conditions. Save that. Let's try again. And there you go. We just got the argument swap mixed around. So that's essentially the same as the find object by. It's pretty much using this CRUD method to sort of like abstract away, well, provide another layer of abstraction so we can easily get the result that we want, right? So this is how we can get directly into the CRUD object to get the actual CRUD methods like read, create, update, delete, and I think there's a couple more in there as well for search and count and aggregation, stuff like that. So that's how we get access to the CRUD object, by calling the entity manager, which governs all these CRUD methods, right? But we don't really do it like this within our application. We tend to use the repository methods to get data within our controllers. What I've just done is mostly what we will do from our event subscribers. That's mostly where we tend to go with the CRUD methods, because we tend to be pushing data to the database and updating. So that's more like where we'd be using some of those longer method called, or longer chain method, because there's no method within the repository to sort of like create data to our database. It's more like reading and fetching and getting, not and updating, but not to sort of like create stuff. I suppose I could actually create a method that does that, but yeah, there's plenty of ways we can actually get these information. So that's as easy as it was. We didn't need to do nothing with our database. All we did was ensure that switch my screen. All we did was ensure that our env was pointing to our right environment using our .env file, which is being read internally via our data object component. It's doing all of that internal. We didn't have to do nothing like passing dependencies for database connection. We simply declare our model and we declare our database table, and that is it. That is all we need to do, so long as your model is set up properly, which is not a lot. So you see what exactly the model contains. It contains the table schema and the table schema ID, which defines our database table. And this is optional. This is not really doing much to get that data back. It's just that this is being used internally to automatically populate stuff like the update field, or if it's deleting, it already know the column, the primary key column to delete from. All we didn't have to do is pass the actual ID of what we're trying to delete, because it already knows the primary key for that particular column because we passed it right here. So that's what this table schema ID is doing. But the important one is that one, so we know what tables we're getting our data from, and we must pass that back to the parent construct, because that is where the magic happens, right? That's where it gels it all together for us and provides us with that easy access to our data within that database. So that's the models. And again, any table that you've got in your database, we have to create a model for it. And if that table is going to contain data that's going to be submitted via a form, then we have to also create an entity for it as well. And there's other bits that we can do to extend the functionality of our models by declaring other methods within those models, which is going to be specific to that particular model, so we can then use it within our controller to do certain stuff for us, right? So that's pretty much the basic gist of how I've set up these models to be pretty simple, because all the hard work is already being done in the core framework part. So once we declare the relevant arguments, the framework will do the rest for us. And you also notice that we sort of like build our login form, where you can see, let's get that back on the screen. Let's change our scene. You notice that we never really had to do nothing with sessions either, because if you remember, when we set up our application through the index file, we're already passing in our session. That's already been taken care of as well at the very top level of our application. So by the time we get to that form, session is already declared. So we never really need to pass sessions in our template to start any session. That is being done for us automatically, right? We have no need to do that or do that ourselves. It's being done internally already. What else? Obviously, there's a little bit more to do in order to sort of like get this login form to work, but we can actually test it and see if we got anything different. Let's just reload that page, try logging in, and we're getting something back now which we wasn't before, so that's good. And we're going to have a look at this error and see what it's saying. So it's saying call to an undefined method, app model, user model, email exist, right? We've just created our model, but this model did not contain that email exist function, right? That is that's what I was referring to a while ago. We could create additional methods that's going to live in our models, that's going to be specific to that model. Now, the email exists function, obviously you can tell by the name, it checks if an email exists before it progressed on. And because we've not yet got that model, because we've not yet got that method, we're getting that error, which is good because it shows that our login form is actually now doing something now that we've got that model set up. And by the way, I've updated this today. I know I mentioned to you that we're doing our own error handling, and you saw a different, well, similar layout, but you could see a different background. I've simple sort of like changed the background, but it's effectively the same error handling that we're doing. And it also should show you like snippets of code where we're getting that error from, right? And this bit, this is the authenticator that is calling, and it's checking somewhere in here that the email, if the email exists or not. Obviously the email doesn't exist, so it's going to spit out that error. So let's actually, we will need to actually implement these methods. I've already got these methods in my application. We can either copy and paste them, or we could simply build them out. And I'm going to actually build this one out within the model so you can see some of the techniques and process of how I go about doing that. So I'm going to switch my screen again, and we're going to get our model, and we're going to implement that email exists method. So if I go into my model, my user model, I'm going to come down here to say public function email exist, right? and I know this method should return a boolean. So the email either exists, true, or it doesn't, false, right? So I'm going to say the return type should be a boolean, right? And it's going to take in a couple of arguments. And the first one is going to be a string, which is going to be the email. And the second is going to be an integer, which is going to be ignore ID. I'm going to set that to null. And I set that to null because it's not always required, right? It's required if we've got an ID, we can check using the ID whether the email exists or not. But if we're sort of like in a situation where the ID is not required, then we can simply skip that process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check if the first argument is not empty. Say if it's not empty, email, I'm going to say result, create a variable called result. I'm going to equal this, get repo. And remember, because I'm in my user model, I can go straight to that get repo method, right? I'm going to say find object by. So I'm getting that find object by method. I remember the first argument is going to be the conditions. So what are we finding the object by? So I'm going to find the object by the email, right? Because in my data, in my users table, email is set as a unique key. So email is going to be unique for everyone. So we can use it to actually uniquely find the queried user. So I'm going to say email, which is going to be the argument that we've set here. So whatever email we pass into this email exists is going to try and find the object based on that email, right? And a simple one to return all the columns for that object. I'm going to do asterisk, which is going to be that. Which, if you work with MySQL select statement, you know that asterisk sort of like returns all the column on that particular object. So I'm going to say semicolon right there to end that particular line. I'm going to say if results, I hate this keyboard. If result, then we're going to say if result ID, because at this point we've got the result, should be result, not results. At this point we got that object back, so we can say result ID equal ignore ID, return true, right? So if the ID equals the ID that we pass into the second argument, we're going to just return true. Else we're going to return false at the end, because this method must return a boolean, and because we've returned true right within this conditional, we then have to return false, because otherwise it would have failed, right? And that's essentially all we check if an email exists by using our find object by method, which is going to access that database, check if that email exists via the email argument. If it doesn't exist, it means that that object is not in a database. It's going to return false. If it does exist and it matches the ID that we pass in as a second argument, it returns true, right? And that's simply going to return the object that this method would have been wrapped around, just like so. So save that.